What if the past was never as silent as we imagined? Across the world, in places separated by oceans, mountains, and centuries of forgotten migration, there are stories of beings larger than ordinary people. They appear in the old pages of Scripture, in the shadowed halls of Greek myth, in the oral histories of Native American nations, and in fragments of local memory passed down beside fires, rivers, and burial grounds. Some are called Nephilim. Some are remembered as Titans. Some are described simply as the Old Ones, the Tall Ones, the people who came before. At first glance, these stories seem to belong to the realm of myth, shaped by fear, imagination, and the human need to explain a world that once felt enormous and unknowable. But the persistence of the pattern is difficult to ignore. Why would so many cultures, disconnected from one another, preserve the image of powerful, human-like beings of unusual size? The question is not whether ancient giants walked the earth as 20-foot monsters from legend. That is the easy version of the mystery, and perhaps the least interesting one. The deeper question is quieter. Did our ancestors remember encounters with real biological outliers? With extinct relatives? With human groups whose bodies, skulls, or genetic inheritance seemed strange enough to become myth? Tonight, we move from storytelling into something closer to a forensic investigation. Not to prove a legend, and not to dismiss it too quickly, but to examine the fragile places where memory, bone, DNA, and myth begin to overlap. Some mysteries begin not in laboratories, but in the oldest habit of humanity: telling stories. Long before written history, people carried knowledge in memory. They remembered floods, migrations, famines, eclipses, vanished animals, and wars whose original causes had faded into mist. A story could survive when stone inscriptions cracked, when cities burned, and when names disappeared from the earth. The giant appears again and again in this long human archive. In the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim stand at the edge of the ancient world, mysterious and difficult to define. In Greek tradition, the Titans are vast ancestral powers, older than the gods who replaced them. In parts of North American oral history, including stories associated with the Paiute, unusually large or formidable people appear as part of the remembered landscape. These traditions are not identical. They do not prove one another. Each belongs to its own culture, language, and spiritual world. Yet the repetition raises a question that is less about monsters and more about memory. Could ancient people have preserved impressions of real encounters, later enlarged by time, ritual, and imagination? A tall enemy becomes a giant. A powerful tribe becomes a race of giants. A skull or burial mound becomes a doorway into a world before the present one. Myth is not a photograph. It does not behave like evidence in a courtroom, but myth can preserve emotional truth, cultural memory, and sometimes a distorted echo of something that once happened. And if we listen carefully, the first clue may not be in what the stories claim. It may be in why they refuse to disappear. It began with a single object, almost too small to carry the weight of what it revealed. In Denisova Cave, deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, researchers discovered a fragment of finger bone and several teeth. They did not look like the entrance to a new chapter of human history. They looked modest, worn, easily overlooked. But when scientists examined the DNA, the bone did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal in the simple way researchers expected either. It belonged to another ancient human relative, a population now known as the Denisovans. The name came from the cave, but the meaning soon spread far beyond Siberia. Denisovan DNA would later be found in the ancestry of people living thousands of miles away, especially in parts of Asia and Oceania. This suggested that our ancient world was not a clean ladder of progress, with one human species replacing another. It was a landscape of meetings, migrations, and interbreeding. The teeth from Denisova were unusually large compared with modern human teeth. This does not mean Denisovans were giants in the mythic sense. But it does remind us that extinct human relatives could look different from us in ways that would have been immediately noticeable. Imagine an ancient encounter at the edge of a forest or along a river valley. Two human groups, related but unfamiliar, studying one another across the distance. Perhaps no legend was born in that moment, but perhaps some memories begin exactly that way. The most unsettling discoveries are not always the ones that contradict the past. Sometimes they simply make it more crowded. For generations, many people imagined human evolution as a narrow road. There were primitive ancestors behind us, modern humans at the end, and extinction as the fate of every side branch. But ancient DNA has changed that picture. The road is more like a braided river, splitting, crossing, merging, and disappearing underground. Modern humans carry traces of other human populations. Neanderthal ancestry remains in many people today. Denisovan ancestry remains as well, especially in populations whose ancestors passed through parts of Asia and the Pacific world. This means that humanity is not a pure category sealed off from everything that came before. We are, in a very real biological sense, the result of ancient contact. The word hybrid can sound cold, as if it belongs in a laboratory, but behind it is a deeply human story. There were meetings, there were children, there were communities that absorbed strangers, enemies, partners, or neighbors whose bodies and faces may have seemed unusual. If a Denisovan, a Neanderthal, and a Homo sapiens stood together beneath the same winter sky, they would all be human relatives. But they would not have looked exactly alike. That difference matters. Because when later cultures remembered the deep past, they may not have been inventing from emptiness. They may have been trying to describe a world where humanity itself had more shapes than we once allowed ourselves to imagine. In 2019, a new kind of portrait emerged from the darkness of prehistory. It was not painted from a skull found whole in the ground. It was not reconstructed from a complete skeleton laid out on a museum table. Instead, researchers used patterns in ancient DNA, especially chemical markers connected to gene activity, to infer aspects of Denisovan anatomy. The result was not a perfect face. It was a scientific approximation, cautious and incomplete, but it suggested a being both familiar and strange, human enough to recognize, different enough to disturb the clean boundaries we often draw around ourselves. There is something haunting about reconstructing a face from genetic silence. A person who lived tens of thousands of years ago leaves behind no name, no language we can hear, no memory of their own childhood. And yet, from a fragment of bone, science begins to restore presence. A brow, a jaw, a possible outline of the head. This is where the search for ancient giants becomes more serious than folklore. Not because Denisovans prove the myths literally true, they do not. But they prove that ancient human diversity was real, complex, and hidden for most of modern history. The fossil record is incomplete. DNA survives only under certain conditions. Entire populations may have vanished without leaving evidence we have yet recognized. So when myth speaks of strange ancestors, we should not automatically accept every claim. But neither should we assume the past was as simple as our textbooks once made it seem. In the 19th century, another kind of evidence began to appear in the public imagination. Across North America, newspapers reported discoveries of large skeletons, unusual skulls, and ancient remains found in mounds, caves, and construction sites. Some reports appeared in local papers, others reached larger publications. The language was often dramatic, shaped by the style and assumptions of the time. To modern eyes, these accounts are difficult to handle. Some may have described real finds that were misunderstood. Some may have exaggerated ordinary remains. Some may have been hoaxes, commercial entertainments, or newspaper inventions written for a public fascinated by the ancient world. But the sheer number of reports became part of a larger mystery. If so many giant skeletons were supposedly found, where are they now? Why are they not displayed in modern museums? Why do so many accounts seem to end in silence? This is where careful thinking becomes essential. A missing artifact does not automatically prove anything. Museums lost, misplaced, misidentified, and poorly documented many things in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Scientific standards were uneven. Human remains were often handled in ways that would be unacceptable today. At the same time, the disappearance of evidence leaves room for suspicion, speculation, and unresolved questions. The mature approach is not to believe every report and not to dismiss them all with a wave of the hand. It is to ask what each account can actually support and where the evidence turns from bone into rumor. An old newspaper is a strange kind of time machine. The paper yellows, the ink fades, the sentences carry the confidence of another age. A report might describe laborers opening a mound and finding skeletons of unusual size, or a farmer discovering bones in a field after a storm has washed away the soil. But a newspaper report is not a skeleton. It is a record of someone saying something happened. That distinction matters. In the 19th century, measurements were often imprecise, eyewitness testimony was unreliable, and the public appetite for curiosities was enormous. A tall skeleton could become enormous through retelling. A skull distorted by burial pressure could become evidence of a lost race. There were also genuine medical conditions that could create unusual bodies. Gigantism and acromegaly, often connected to disorders of the pituitary gland, can produce extraordinary height or enlarged features. Rare individuals in ancient communities may have stood out so dramatically that their remains, discovered centuries later, seem to belong to another category of being. This does not require us to imagine a separate race of giants. It only asks us to remember that human biology has always included extremes. A 7-foot person in a small prehistoric community would have been unforgettable. In oral memory, that person might grow taller still. The question is not whether every report was true. Many probably were not. The question is whether some small portion of these accounts preserve real encounters with biological anomalies, later swallowed by poor documentation and the dust of time. The most sensitive part of this story lies beneath the soil of North America. Ancient mounds were not empty mysteries waiting for outsiders to interpret them. Many were burial places, sacred landscapes, and cultural works connected to indigenous peoples with living descendants. For too long, these sites were treated as puzzles detached from the communities to whom they mattered. In the 19th century, the so-called mound builder question was shaped by assumptions that often denied indigenous achievement. Some writers imagined vanished races because they could not accept that native peoples had built complex earthworks, cities, trade networks, and ceremonial landscapes. That context matters deeply. When old reports describe giant skeletons from mounds, they are not neutral fragments. They belong to a period when archaeology, myth-making, racism, showmanship, and genuine curiosity were tangled together. A responsible investigation must separate the biological question from the cultural damage done by careless interpretation. Were unusual human remains ever found? Possibly. Were some accounts exaggerated or fabricated? Almost certainly. Were many ancient sites misunderstood through the lens of colonial imagination? Without question. The truth, if it exists, is not served by turning indigenous history into a prop for modern fantasy. It is served by humility, by careful evidence, and by respect for the people whose ancestors are being discussed. Perhaps the most important lesson of the mound reports is not that they reveal a lost giant civilization. Perhaps it is that our hunger for mystery must never outrun our responsibility to the dead. Far to the south, along the dry coast of Peru, another kind of human mystery rests in the desert. The Paracas skulls are famous for their elongated shape. Some are dramatically stretched, rising backward and upward in ways that seem strange to modern eyes. Their appearance has invited speculation for decades, especially from those eager to connect them with visitors from the stars or unknown non-human ancestry. But the first explanation is not alien, it is cultural. Artificial cranial deformation has been practiced by many societies around the world. By binding or shaping the head during infancy, when the skull is still soft and growing, communities could create forms associated with identity, beauty, status, lineage, or spiritual meaning. This practice does not make the people less human. It makes them more culturally complex. The Paracas skulls remind us that the human body has often been used as a canvas for belonging. Bone can record social meaning. A skull can become an emblem of who someone was allowed to be. Still, some researchers and independent investigators have raised questions about certain features, including cranial volume, bone structure, and reported genetic results. The claims remain debated, and the evidence is not settled in the way popular retellings often suggest. That uncertainty is important. The Paracas skulls do not need to be turned into something impossible to be fascinating. They are already extraordinary as evidence of human ritual, identity, and the deep desire to mark the body with meaning that survives death. DNA has a special power in modern storytelling. A bone can be argued over. A photograph can be doubted. A newspaper report can be dismissed as exaggeration. But DNA feels different. It feels like a code beneath opinion, a final witness that cannot be bribed by memory. Yet DNA is not magic. It is fragile, technical, and difficult to interpret, especially when dealing with ancient remains. Reports surrounding the Paracas skulls have included claims of unusual mitochondrial DNA, sometimes described as containing mutations not matching known human, primate, or animal patterns. Such claims are often repeated with great confidence, but the scientific picture remains incomplete. Independent testing, contamination control, peer review, sample provenance, and transparent methods all matter. Without those safeguards, even an intriguing result must remain a question, not a conclusion. This is not a failure of imagination. It is the discipline that protects wonder from becoming illusion. If unusual DNA were ever confirmed in ancient remains, the implications would be profound. But extraordinary interpretation requires careful evidence, especially when the subject touches human ancestry, cultural heritage, and public trust. The more mysterious a claim appears, the more patience it deserves. And perhaps that is the real lesson of ancient DNA. It does not merely reveal secrets. It teaches restraint. It asks us to hold possibility in one hand and uncertainty in the other. Only then can the past speak, without being forced to say more than it knows. There is a quiet difference between evidence that is missing and evidence that never existed. Much of the ancient world has been lost through ordinary forces: water, fire, acidic soil, war, neglect, and time itself. Bones crumble. Labels fall away. Collections are moved. Excavation notes vanish in drawers. A specimen that once seemed unimportant may be discarded before a later generation understands its value. This is especially true for discoveries made before modern archaeology had clear standards. In the 19th century, human remains were often collected casually, displayed publicly, or described without reliable context. Measurements might be taken incorrectly. A skeleton might be called giant simply because it looked large to an untrained observer. A burial might be disturbed before anyone documented its exact position. This creates a difficult space for researchers and audiences alike. On one side, there are people who see every missing bone as proof of deliberate suppression. On the other side, there are people who treat every old report as worthless because it does not meet modern standards. The wiser path is narrower. We can admit that old archives contain mistakes, exaggerations, and myths. We can also admit that they may preserve fragments of real events that were poorly understood at the time. History is not a courtroom where every missing file means guilt. It is more often a ruined library, where smoke, rain, and human error have damaged the shelves. The question is not whether everything survived. The question is, what can still be carefully recovered from the silence? The figure of the giant has always carried more than height. In myth, giants often stand at the border between worlds. They are older than the present order. They belong to a time before familiar rules. They are powerful, dangerous, mournful, sometimes wise and often doomed. This symbolic role may help explain why giant stories endure. A giant is the human form made strange. It is us, but enlarged beyond comfort. It turns the body into a landscape, the ancestor into a monument, the enemy into a force of nature. Through giants, cultures imagine the past as bigger than the present, both physically and morally. But symbolism does not exclude memory. A culture might transform a real encounter into a mythic image. A very tall warrior, an extinct human relative, a skull shaped by tradition, or a burial containing unusual remains could become part of a larger story about origins, conflict, or divine ancestry. Over centuries, the factual center may disappear while the emotional outline remains. That is how memory often works. It does not preserve the past like glass. It preserves it like water preserves light, bending it, breaking it, carrying fragments downstream. So when we ask whether giants were real, we may be asking too small a question. Perhaps we should ask what ancient people were trying to remember when they spoke of beings larger than themselves. Were they describing fear, reverence, difference, lost relatives, or the simple knowledge that the world before us was stranger than the world we inherited? Modern science has not made humanity smaller. It has made our story wider. We now know that Homo sapiens shared the planet with other human relatives. We know that some of them interbred with our ancestors. We know that traces of those encounters remain in living people today. We know that ancient cultures shaped bodies, honored unusual forms, and buried their dead in ways that still challenge interpretation. None of this proves a race of giants from legend. But it does challenge the older, simpler idea that human history was a straight line leading neatly to us. Instead, it suggests a world filled with vanished branches, absorbed populations, biological variation, and memories that may have outlived the evidence that first created them. The textbook version of humanity is becoming less like a clean diagram and more like an old family photograph, damaged at the edges, crowded with faces whose names we are only beginning to learn. This may be the most quietly profound revelation of all. We are not the isolated endpoint of evolution. We are the surviving conversation between many forms of human life, some known, some still hidden, some perhaps erased before science had the tools to recognize them. The myths of giants may not tell us that monsters walked the earth. They may tell us that our ancestors understood something we are only now rediscovering. Human identity has always been more fragile, more diverse, and more mysterious than any single story can hold. At the end of the search, the giants remain partly in shadow. They stand between scripture and soil, between old newspapers and museum drawers, between shaped skulls in desert tombs and DNA fragments recovered from cold caves. Some dissolve into myth, some into error, some into the ordinary tragedy of evidence lost before anyone knew how to protect it, and some remain unresolved. That is not a disappointing ending. It may be the most honest one. The past does not owe us certainty. It gives us fragments, a tooth larger than expected, a skull shaped by ancient hands, a story carried through generations, a genetic trace inside the living body. From these fragments, we build questions. Sometimes the questions are more valuable than the answers we hope to find. Were there ancient giants? Not in the simple way legend often imagines them. But were there ancient humans and human relatives whose bodies, faces, and genetic inheritance would have astonished us? The evidence suggests that the answer is yes. Perhaps the real mystery is not whether humanity once encountered giants. Perhaps the real mystery is how much of humanity we have forgotten. If we are a hybrid species, shaped by contact, survival, migration, and memory, then our future may be as open as our past was complicated. We are not finished beings. We are a continuing story, written in bone, blood, silence, and time. And somewhere in that story, still waiting to be understood, are the shadows of those who came before us.